Adiós. Adiós.
Ani ona musí hrozná zima.
Si vezmeme horkou čokoládu.
We're going to start with introductions. My name is Noma Gurich. I am a justice on the Oklahoma Supreme Court. And I'll start with, how about my table on my right?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jim Priest. I'm a recovering attorney. I also happen to be the CEO of Sunbeam Family Services, a social service organization in Oklahoma City, and I am playing the role of the prosecutor in this case.
My name is Steve Ellis, and I'm a philosophy professor at the University of Oklahoma, and I'll be playing the role of Dimitri Andre, the father that you just saw.
I'm Gloria McGee Denton. I'm one of the pastors here at Asbury Church in Tulsa, here in town, and I'm going to be playing Miss Ethics today.
My name's Bill Leach. I went to Memorial High School, which is having its 30-year class reunion this summer. Have a wife here in Tulsa, 3 boys that fortunately for me are out of my house, and I'm playing the role of the defense counsel.
And as you can tell, I'm playing the role of judge. All right, we are going to go ahead and start this case. This is the trial of the state versus ethics. And to begin the case, you in the audience are going to be our jurors. And in order to be a juror, I'm going to ask that you take an oath. And so if you are able to just stay seated, if you will raise your right hand, and I will read you the oath, and then you can answer appropriately. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that you will discharge your duties as jurors to the best of your ability, and that you will reach a fair and just decision in this case, now on trial, and reach a true verdict according to the law and the evidence presented to you, so help you God? Thank you. The defendant, Ethics, is charged with the crime of conspiracy with Dimitri Andre to commit the murder of Ladja Andre. The defendant, Ethics, is presumed innocent of the crime of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, and the presumption continues unless, after consideration of all the evidence, you are convinced of his guilt, her guilt, beyond a reasonable doubt. The state has the burden of presenting the evidence that establishes guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. For those of you who have been summoned as jurors, I remind you that jury service is a legal obligation as well as a civic duty. Each of you is an officer of the court, just as the judge, the attorney representing the prosecution, and the attorney representing the defense. Your office as juror is one of extreme public trust. The services you perform as juror are as important and essential to the administration of justice as those performed by the judge and the attorneys. You should not allow sympathy or prejudice or bias to influence your decision. It is essential you should keep your minds free and open at all times throughout this trial, and that you should not be influenced by anything except the evidence you hear and see in the courtroom. The opening statement of the prosecutor and the defense attorney are intended to assist you in understanding the issues in this case. Please listen carefully to the testimony in this case. You will be required to reach a verdict at the conclusion of the trial. Following the opening statements, the witnesses will be called to testify. After the evidence is complete, I will instruct you on the law applicable to this case. The attorneys are then permitted closing arguments. Closing arguments are permitted for the purposes of persuasion only. When closing arguments are completed, the case will be submitted to you. You will then consider your verdict. This is we are in a limited time frame, so for the purposes of this trial, you should assume that all of the witnesses have been sworn to tell the truth under penalty of perjury. So we will begin with opening statement by prosecution. Mr. Priest.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Just a couple of minutes ago, you raised your right hand and took a solemn oath. Perhaps you've done that on other occasions. You may have perhaps served on another jury, or you've made promises before, maybe at a marriage altar. It requires you to not just say words, but to follow up with action. And that's what we're going to ask you to do today. The judge said to you as part of your oath, you must reach a fair and just verdict. And you promised that you would. Not an easy verdict, not a feel-good verdict, but a verdict that's based on the evidence and the law that's presented to you. And I must tell you, quite frankly, I've been given an unenviable task. I have to prosecute ethics. That's like prosecuting Mr. Rogers. Who wants to convict ethics? Ethics, at least as we've traditionally known her, seems like a nice person. Seems like she wants us to do the good things in life. Promises that she will give us guidance. But you're going to see a different side of ethics today. And as is sometimes the case in other oaths that you've taken, perhaps at the marriage altar, things don't always turn out as you anticipated. And I think the same thing is true with Miss Ethics. The evidence that we will present to you today will show the flip side of ethics, that she's not there to breathe words into your ear of hope and encouragement and goodness, but that she has an agenda. And that agenda was made plain and clear, as you could see in the video. She spoke into the ear of Mr. Andre and urged him to commit an act which on his own he would not have committed. she suggested to him that it was the right thing to do. And Mr. Andre is going to testify in what, frankly, is a very tragic case. A case where he had to make a decision, but he did not make this decision alone. She will admit in her testimony she was in that very watchtower with him. She was speaking to him. And I'm going to ask you to do what Miss Ethics constantly asks us to do, to take responsibility. And your vote to convict her is not a vote to send her to an execution chamber or even to a jail cell, but simply this, that she would be held responsible for her actions, as she always urges us to be responsible for our actions. In a few minutes, after you hear the testimony and the evidence, I'll have an opportunity to speak to you again, and I'm going to ask you to do a very difficult thing. And remember I said when we take oaths, it's not that we take oaths to do something easy, but it's often to do something very difficult. And I'm going to ask you to do something difficult. I'm going to ask you to vote to convict the equivalent of Mr. Rogers, Miss Ethics, not to send her to the execution chamber, but simply to tell her she must be held responsible for her actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Leach?
Thank you, Your Honor. In this age of virtually unlimited government power, I think it's important that we remember what the Founding Fathers thought about what would happen with this government, our government, because they knew that this government, our government, was going to act like every other government has always acted, which is they will seek to expand their power at the extent of the governed. So two things that our Founding Fathers built into our Constitution and laws that's going to be very important to your decision-making process here are the presumption of innocence and the burden of proof. Justice Gurich has already told you that as we sit here right now, Ethics is not guilty, is presumed innocent, and she retains that presumption unless and until the state meets their burden to show beyond a reasonable doubt that a murder was committed, that a conspiracy was committed, and that Ethics is a decision maker as opposed to a framework for decision making. So let's examine a little bit the concept of a burden. And if all of you remember from second or third grade vocabulary, a burden was one of the vocabulary words, second or third grade, can't remember. A burden is a heavy load. And that word, burden of proof, was chosen. The word burden in burden of proof was chosen for that very specific reason. It was meant to be a heavy load. So what's the heavy load that the prosecution has here? They have to prove to you, number one, that a murder has been committed. They have to prove to you, number two, and all of the elements of a murder have been committed. Justice Gurich will tell you what that is during the course of the instructions. They have to prove to you every single element of a conspiracy, and Justice Gurich will tell you what that is. And lastly and fundamentally, they have to prove to you that ethics is a decision maker rather than a guide. There are some things in this case that are undisputed, and we won't be contesting. There was a horrific decision that had to have been made here, one that had no good consequences. There was a decision that had to be made that either led to the death of one person or the death of 300 people. The decision that was made led to the death of one person, but saved the lives of 300 people. What is disputed in this case, however, is the notion that ethics tells us that it's going to be easy. That if you will just do what we are all taught to do, then life will be perfect and golden and easy. And that is highly disputed. Ethics has never said that. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. Most of the decisions that we make, and this case is a classic example, have consequences that must be borne, and ethics is not the one that bears those consequences. It's us that have to face the consequences of our decision making. Most of the time, there's two right answers or two wrong answers, and we've got to choose which is the most right or the least wrong. And it's our responsibility to make those decisions, not ethics' responsibility. If we had ethics making our decisions for us, then we would not be human. We would be robots. We would be mindless automatons, and we have to accept the responsibility for our share of the consequences of our decisions. It is disputed that the prosecutor will tell you that we wouldn't be here had a different decision been made, and I suggest to you the evidence will show we would still be here had a different decision been made. If the other decision had been made, we would have had 300 deaths, and we would have the same prosecutor here making the same arguments against the same defendant, ethics, but would be charging ethics with the responsibility for 300 deaths instead of one death. And finally, it's highly disputed that ethics is a decision maker. Ethics is a concept and a framework and not a decision maker. If all of our decisions were made for us, we wouldn't have that gnawing at us that keeps us up at night and stresses us about the consequences of our decision. We would just be floating along on a sea of easy, consequence-free decisions that somebody else is making for us. And the last thing I'd like to leave you with is please pay careful attention to the instructions that Justice Gurich will give you. Once you hear the instructions about what constitutes murder, what constitutes conspiracy, you will, that in combination with your common sense and the absence of evidence that you will hear on those elements, will make this one of those rare, easy, consequence-free decisions for you. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Mr. Priest, you may call your witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. We'd call Dimitri Andre. Mr. Andre, you've previously been sworn. Would you tell the court and the jury your full name, please?
My name is Dimitri Andre.
And Mr. Andre, we're here today, obviously, to discuss a very difficult episode in your life. I want to extend my condolences, both personally and on behalf of the state. How are you feeling today?
How can I feel? I murdered my own son. I feel cold. I feel nothing.
What do you remember about the day in question?
The train was early, and Ladya had been fishing. I know that he saw the train and tried to get my attention, and when I didn't come right away, he tried to save them himself. I raised him to be ethical, and he took that into account when he went to go try to draw the bridge. When I saw him fall, I died a little inside. I realized that he was trying to sacrifice himself if need be. So I remember pulling the lever and screaming, but no one could hear.
Well, no one could hear, but it's not because you were alone in that room, is it?
No.
Who else was in that room with you?
She was there.
Your point, let the record reflect the witness is pointing to Ms. Ethics.
I remember looking at Ladya and then looking at the train, and then she appeared beside me, and I was hesitating. I loved my only son, and she told me that it was better to pull the lever, that would be the right thing to do, that would be what Ladya would want me to do. So I listened, and I pulled the lever.
You mentioned earlier that you had taught your son Ladya to be ethical. How did you do that?
I told him to take into account other people, to listen to the promptings of his conscience, the way Lady Ethics appears to all of us. I must say that I regret that now. It was at the promptings of Lady Ethics that I essentially ended my own life there. I'm a hollow man. I have nothing to live for now.
And in fact, is it not true that Miss Ethics also appeared to your son, urging him to take the action that he took?
I am quite certain of that, yes.
You've talked a little bit about the words that she spoke into your ear. Do you believe that she participated and entered into an agreement with you to commit the act that you committed?
She urged me. She advocated. She told me that it would be the correct thing to do. She didn't just say, it's your son versus the people on that train. She said, save the people on that train.
And do you believe your decision would have been different had ethics not been present with you, speaking to you, urging you?
I do believe that it would have been different. When my wife died giving birth to Laja, before she passed away, she told me that I should always protect him and keep him safe. So I've always kept that as my guide star. And it never occurred to me that the advice of ethics would run afoul of that. But that was always how I felt. And I was hesitating. And she, in the moment, which I deeply regret, she convinced me.
Do you believe that ethics should be held responsible for the decision?
I believe that ethics helped me make that decision. I blame myself, but I blame her as well for urging me on.
And should she be held responsible, sir?
Yes, I do believe she should be.
And is there anyone else, do you think, that should be held responsible for this decision?
I blame myself. I should not have listened to her. I did. I should not have listened.
Did you, prior to this decision, did you attend meetings of the Oklahoma Business Ethics Consortium?
I had indeed. Yes, I did.
And in fact, you've heard Ms. Lynn Flynn speak on the subject of ethics, have you not?
I have indeed, yes.
Do you believe that the Oklahoma Business Ethics Consortium and Ms. Flynn should be included as co-conspirators to conspire to commit murder?
I would think that that would be appropriate. She's the one who introduced me to Ms. Ethics.
Your Honor, at this time, we'd move to amend the indictment to include Ms. Flynn and the Business Ethics Consortium as unindicted co-conspirators in this crime.
Is there objection?
I have no objection, Your Honor. That is the prosecutor's decision and a classic example of how the state is going to an extreme in their abuse of power. The prosecution against all of these people would be every bit as baseless as the prosecution is against ethics.
Well, my ruling is going to be that I'm going to deny your request. As you mentioned, the business ethics group and their principal are unindicted in Oklahoma, either through indictment or through information. You certainly may reserve your right to bring a separate action against other parties.
Thank you, Your Honor. And may I request that the bailiff take Ms. Flynn into custody so she does not escape?
Well, I think it's, as I've told everyone, she's presumed innocent. She's unindicted. She's not been charged, and so there's no grounds for her confinement at this point, so that's denied.
Stick around. Mr. Andre, do you believe in your conversations both on the day of the event and in prior discussions that you had with Ms. Ethics, did she ever lead you to believe that if you followed her guidance, her urging, that she would leave you with a feeling of goodness in yourself and in others?
She told me that life would never be perfect, but that she told me that following her teachings would lead me to do as well as I could. And I now see that that's false. I would be better off if I had my lodgia. So she never promised me heaven on earth, but she promised me that things would go well with me, and things have not gone well with me.
Had ethics not been present, do you believe you would have made a different decision?
I'm quite certain that I would have made a different decision.
Thank you. That's all I have, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Andre. You may step down. For the sake of the time today, we are not going to proceed with cross-examination of Mr. Andre. Instead, we're going to ask the prosecution to call the next witness.
Yes. This time we'd call Miss Ethics. Miss Ethics, I'll remind you that you were sworn to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Would you state your name for the record and for the jury, please?
My name is Ethics, Ethics.
And can you tell us a little bit about your background, please?
Certainly. I was born with humankind thousands of years ago, at the moment that humans became self-aware. And like yourselves, I too ponder, why am I here? Some will say I have a more theological origin. Some will say I'm an evolutionary adaptation. Others will say I am a mere illusion. It doesn't really matter to me much what my origins are, but what I know is I exist. I am in you. I am with you. I am a tool. I am a framework for making decisions. But I do not make the decisions, and I do not have any ability to make the decisions.
Well, ma'am, you've heard the testimony of Mr. Andre here. Certainly you have some response, some reaction to what you've heard.
Of course, I feel horrible. I am a woman of compassion and principle, and I want Dimitri to know that my heart goes out to him. When the consequences of decisions are as emotionally devastating as they are for you, Dimitri, it reminds me of how little control I have over the decisions that people make. I am heartbroken today.
Well, ma'am, you are shoveling on the emotion in front of this jury, but in fact, you were present on the day of this event, were you not?
Yes, I was.
And in fact, you appeared and worked with Mr. Andre on moral decision-making, not just on this day, but since he'd been a child.
Yes, certainly.
And do you believe that you've ever had an impact on the decisions that Mr. Andre made?
Of course I've had an impact on him.
You've been a source of influence, haven't you?
Yes.
You were influential in this day, were you not?
Yes, I was.
And you made an agreement with Mr. Andre to make the decision that he made, didn't you?
Maybe not that much.
Oh, not that much?
I was present. I had an impact. There was no pact in order for him to choose a certain outcome.
But your long-standing relationship with him would evidence an agreement between the two of you that you would be influential in his decision-making, correct?
That is true.
And again, you do not deny you were influential in his decision on this day, correct?
Yes, I was.
In fact, you were a co-conspirator in the murder, were you not?
No, I was not.
Well, ma'am, do you recall a time that you told Mr. Andre that if he followed you, he would find great pain rather than overwhelming joy?
No, not necessarily. But I have impressed upon Mr. Andre throughout his life, through those around him and his parents, and smaller decisions that he had to make, that making ethical decisions don't always feel good. Sometimes it hurts.
Isn't it true, ma'am, that not only were you in the room with Mr. Andre when he made that decision, but you were the influence that prompted Ladya to go down to the wheelhouse and to try to help out in some way?
I was.
So you were very busy that day, weren't you?
I was.
Let me refer you back to a point in time, ma'am. Were you present in the Garden of Eden?
I was. Fig leaf and all, yes.
And that didn't turn out so well, did it? Were you present in Ford's Theater on April 9th?
Yes. I was there too.
And that didn't turn out so well, did it? Were you present at Auschwitz in Germany?
Yes, I was.
And that didn't turn out so well, did it? and you were present with Mr. Andre in the wheelhouse. And that did not turn out so well, did it? That's all I have, Your Honor. Thank you.
We'll now have examination by Mr. Leach of ethics.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Ethics, can you describe for us the good consequences of the choice that Mr. Andre made that day?
Well, of course. Of course. Because Mr. Andre made that decision, one life was certainly lost. But Mr. Andre's decision meant 300 lives were saved. 300 families did not have to grieve. 300 sets of parents did not have to bury children. Many siblings did not have to bury their siblings. Many children did not have to bury their parents. There was tremendous good that came that day.
We have heard and seen how anguished Mr. Andre is over the consequence of his decision. Can you help us understand why he feels that way?
Well, when we're traumatized, the brain closes down and shuts down as a survival mechanism. It not only disables our pain sensors in order that we can deal with the trauma right before us and live through the situation, but it also disables our ability to necessarily sense goodness, which might overstimulate us and itself kill us. Mr. Andre finds it hard to see the good that's come from this decision because of a natural psychological defense mechanism that's currently keeping him alive. In time, he'll come to understand that there would have been tremendous pain also had he made the other decision.
Objection. Calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Can you tell us what it's really like to be ethics?
It's joyful, honestly. It's thrilling. It's meaningful. It's delightful. There's great purpose in it. But as the prosecutor already reminded us, I have been there at some awful, awful low points in human history. So to be me is painful, and it's horrible, and it's ugly too.
Since he asked about those things, since you were with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, did you agree with the decision making there?
I didn't lead them to make one decision or another. I was simply there as a resource and a tool for them to pull from.
Did you have did you have the ability to force them to make different choices than they made?
Of course not. I don't have that ability at all.
He asked you about the decisions that led up to Auschwitz. Were you there when those decisions were made?
I was there.
And did you have any ability to change that decision-making process and thereby prevent those catastrophes?
Those were the choices of other people and not me.
Back to Mr. Andre's situation. Can you describe what happened on the day of the accident?
Yes. At the railroad bridge, Dimitri went into the engine room, and he told his son to stay at the edge of the lake and to fish and to just enjoy the morning. And then a ship came, and so Dimitri had to raise the bridge. And the train was supposed to arrive an hour later, but it came early. It came down the tracks quickly, and Ladya saw this. And so he tried to warn his dad to lower the bridge, but his father was busy in the engine room, and he was unaware of the oncoming train. And so Ladya saw himself that he couldn't get his dad's attention, and he saw the train coming, and he saw the bridge up. And being the smart boy that he was, he saw what could happen. So he tried to help. And he tried to lower the bridge himself, but then he fell down into the gearworks.
Can you describe how you interacted with Mr. Andre?
When Dimitri finally saw the train coming and that the bridge was up, in the same instant he looked down. He looked, he saw the train, he saw the bridge, and he looked down, and at the same instant he saw his son. And he saw him down in the gear of the drawbridge, and he had to act. So I wasn't just in the mind of Dimitri, I was also there on the train. I was there with a young drug addict as she was about to shoot up in the bathroom again. I was with a man, a passenger on that train, who was wishing he were dead because his girlfriend had told him he was ugly and was worth nothing to her, and she'd be better without him. I was there in the train when the conductor received a text from his pregnant wife with good news that the baby would come soon, seconds before the stop signal was raised. And I was there when he missed that sign and let the train keep going. And I was with Ladya as he saw the train coming. But when situations like Dimitri's arise, I rush to the scene. Some people say my presence is gut-wrenching. Others say I provide a sense of calm and peace. I show up differently for each person based on their training and their unique abilities and dispositions. And with Dimitri, I felt his anguish and I was there for him. My counsel was relayed through lessons that he had learned from his parents, teaching from his church and his school and his friends. And I heard a clear voice in his mind, the thought of his own son saying to him, "Dad, help me save these people."
Was that the result that Ladya wanted?
Objection. Go on again, calls for speculation.
Sustained, you may rephrase.
Do you know, based on your interaction with Ladya, what result Ladya wanted?
Well, Ladya wanted to do what was right.
Did he want himself to be sacrificed if the result was that 300 other people would be killed?
It wasn't his initial plan, but when things went awry and he fell down into the gearworks, he knew what had to happen.
Did you tell Mr. Andre to lower the bridge?
No. I did not manipulate or tell Dimitri to make the choice that he did, because I can't. Remember, I can't do any more than a fish can hook, than a hook can catch a fish without a fisherman. I don't have the power over free will, and I have no ability to cause any particular decision to be made. The concept might be illustrated, and you all would understand this, when politicians ignore the very laws they pass, or when clerics ignore the scriptures they preach, and athletes violate the rules of the sports that they play. I can only provide a framework for decision making. I cannot force particular decisions to be made.
Ethics, the prosecution claims that you should be held responsible for the death of Ladya Andre, that you conspired to commit murder. Do you agree with this?
I deny those charges. I am not guilty of this. I'm not guilty of willfully desiring to see Ladya dead. That would require me to take pleasure in pain and suffering and loss and murder, and that is the opposite of who I am. That would be unethical. But at the end of the day, taking pleasure in the murder of a beautiful, young, vibrant, precious boy who was deeply loved by his father, it is what I'm accused of, but it goes against everything that I am.
Is there anything else you'd like to add for the jury's consideration?
You know, just this. I am ethics. I am like air. I surround you. I am within you. Most of the time, you don't even notice that I'm there. But when you need me most, you suddenly, in that moment, become aware of my presence or my absence. For Dimitri, poor, sweet Dimitri, he was suffocating. He had to make a choice just as he had to breathe. And I gave him a breath of air, and had I not, a little boy and 300 people would be dead today. Telling him his options and helping him weigh one against the other was helping him to breathe. I'm guilty of telling him what his choices were. I am not guilty of what he chose. Remember, in a wrong versus wrong situation, I can help you access your experiences, your knowledge, your wisdom, your maturity, so that I can present options to you, and then you choose, you act. And without hesitation, in this kind of case, some would choose to save their own son. We know that, so that they could avoid the pain that Mr. Andre is experiencing today. Whose heart doesn't go out to him right now? Mine does. But some of us would choose as Dimitri did, to save and allow the lives of 300 to outweigh the life of one. The real truth here, the underlying truth, is that only Dimitri knows why he chose to save 300 people. I didn't make the choice for him. What I know is what he considered before making the decision. And I'm proud to say I was there for him when he needed me. But in the end, I want to stress this very important point. I've never promised that he or anyone else would feel good about every ethical decision that gets made. I have promised that the moral life is worth living. And this worth, this purpose, is not measured by pleasurable sensations. It's not measured by feeling good. Instead, it's embedded in a sense of duty and a sense of love. It is part of our purpose of life. The ethical life, even as Ralph Waldo Emerson said, the purpose of life, an ethical life, is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, to have made a difference in the world you've lived, and to try and live well.
Last question. Was Mr. Andre's intention ever to harm Ladja?
No.
That's all the questions I have, Your Honor.
Thank you. Ms. Ethics, you may step down from the stand and take your seat. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to proceed with closing argument at this time. Mr. Priest for the prosecution will go first since he has the burden of proof. Mr. Priest.
Thank you, Your Honor. Well, that was a mighty fine speech you made, wasn't it? But just because somebody says they're going to tell the truth doesn't mean they're really going to tell the truth. You heard her several times try to duck from questions that I was asking. Oh, I'm not really responsible for this. I'm just a guideline. I'm just the heir. The heir? You're just the heir? She wants you to believe she's like a prancing fairy. I'm just there to give you guidelines. That's not what happened that morning. You heard the testimony of Mr. Andre. She wasn't in the air. She was breathing into his ear. She was telling him the decision to make, the one that she had preordained should happen, the one that she was bragging about saved 300 lives. What is she saying? When you strip all the veneer off the wood, what is she really saying? She's saying this: 300 lives are worth more than one life. Is that really true? Well, let's just tweak the facts for just a minute, just to think about this in a little more depth. What if the people on that train, instead of 300 people of different backgrounds, from drug dealers to broken-hearted lovers, what if they had been 300 people on their way to the penitentiary to face the death penalty? Men and women whose lives really had just a brief span left. What then? What could and should the decision have been made? Well, these people on the train are going to die soon anyway, and Andre's son has his whole life to live. What would she be breathing into his ear in those circumstances? Would she be talking about the joy of 300 lives saved? No, she can't get away with this, I'm in the air. She urges us, she has urged you to take responsibility for your actions. Is that not true? Raise your hand if that's true. And the rest of you are not telling the truth.
Let me remind the jury you're under oath.
You know that you've heard that voice. You've been in the room with her. Is she a mere fairy just floating in the atmosphere? Or is she urging you to take a particular path? You know the answer to that. And while your decision must be based on the evidence and the testimony and the law here, you haven't taken an oath to leave your common sense behind. That which does not make sense to you, if spoken to you in your living room, should be rejected even though it's spoken on a witness stand. And so don't let her get away with these high-sounding phrases of, oh, I've never promised you a rose garden. I just promised to be there and provide guidelines. She took action. She took action not at Auschwitz. She let that one go. She took action not at Ford's Theater. She let that one go. She didn't take action in the garden, but she took action in the wheelhouse. She urged him, and you heard his testimony, she urged him to pull the lever. What would Dmitri have done but for the voice of ethics in his ear? What would you have done but for the voice of ethics in your ear? He would have done what was in his own best self-interest. He would have saved the life of his son, his legacy. But he made a different decision than one he would have made if he'd been left to his own decision-making. He made the decision that she urged him to make. And she keeps talking about, I'm just a hook. You can't catch fish. You gotta have a fisherman. Well, she was the hook. And the hook is a necessary part of catching fish, just as she was the necessary part of this decision. Put it in a different context.
Mr. Priest, you have 1 minute remaining.
If I came to this young man and I put a gun in his hand and it was loaded and I suggested that he point it over at Stevie and pull the trigger, but I'm not telling him to do it, but I'm facilitating it, would you not think I should be responsible for her death? We're not asking you to send ethics to the execution chamber or to a jail cell, but simply to do what she has urged us to do, to take responsibility for her action. We ask you to vote for conviction because in the long run, it'll make me look good.
Thank you, Mr. Priest. Mr. Leach, you may proceed with closing statement.
Thank you, Your Honor. So let's now strip away the rhetoric and the dancing and the speeches and see what the government has done to meet their burden of proof, their heavy load. See what we have with evidence. What evidence is that ethics is a decision maker? And they've proven that by their own testimony. We know that if ethics is a decision maker, we wouldn't have had the Garden of Eden. We wouldn't have had Auschwitz. We wouldn't have had 9/11. We wouldn't have had Ford's Theater. But people are making those decisions, not ethics. And that's why we have those things that happen that way. So where is the proof that the government has brought to you that ethics is a decision maker? Not speeches, not dancing, but proof. Whether there was any conspiracy, they also have the burden of proof to show you that there was a conspiracy, and they also have the burden of proof to show you that the murder was committed. If they haven't satisfied all of those things by beyond a reasonable doubt, then you must acquit. If this was a strictly legal case and not an exercise in something a little bit more important, then this would be the world's the world's shortest closing argument, because it's an easy legal case. You're going to hear in a minute what the definition of murder and what the definition of conspiracy is. There's more than legal issues involved in the case, so I'd like to spend about 2 minutes suggesting to you what I think the correct legal answer is based on what you're going to hear from Justice Gurich in a minute. Number one, what is a murder? There's 4 elements to a murder, and the state has to prove each and every one of those 4 elements. Not 1, not 2, not 3, but all 4 beyond a reasonable doubt. What are those elements? Number 1, that there was a death. That has been satisfied. Number 2, that it was caused by the defendant. They can argue that. The intent was not to cause a death. The intent was to save 300 lives. But let's give them that one. Number 3, that it was an unlawful killing. Where is the evidence that there was anything unlawful about this killing? The intention was not to kill. The intention was to save lives. And finally, and the easiest one that they clearly have not met, is a murder. What distinguishes a murder from every other death is malice aforethought, an evil intention to take the life of another person. There was never any evidence that Mr. Andre ever intended to take the life of his son. He would never do that. His intention was to save the lives of 300. So we have no murder. We have no murder. Number 2, a conspiracy, you'll be told what that is too. A conspiracy to commit a murder requires a murder. We don't have a murder, so we cannot have a conspiracy to commit a murder. You have to have an overt act. There was no overt act on the part of ethics to generate a conspiracy. So we have no murder, we have no conspiracy. So to talk about what I think is the more interesting part of this exercise is whether ethics is a decision maker. And I saw, maybe some of you saw it, a movie in I think it was the late 70s, early 80s called The Verdict. It starred Paul Newman. He was a plaintiff's lawyer suing the Catholic Church. And it had gone not well for him. The Catholic Church had kind of overwhelmed him, and he was thoroughly defeated by the end of the movie. And his closing argument was very short. It was something like, you know, sometimes we're just lost. Please, God, tell us what is right, tell us what is true. And I hadn't gone to law school at that point, had no idea what that meant. I thought that was the silliest closing summation that I'd ever heard. And I didn't quite understand what he was saying until I was asked to be involved in this exercise. And this one put it perfectly in context to me and helped me understand it. We're constantly told that there's such a thing out there as right decisions and wrong decisions. We hear that all the time from Fox News on the right, from MSNBC on the left. There's these right decisions and wrong decisions. Fox News says the right decisions are one thing, and MSNBC says the opposite decision is the right one. And all we've got to do is choose the right decisions. So what we're lost about, I think, is we know that is a lie. We know at some molecular level that the truth is that every decision we make has a consequence, and that we have to deal with those consequences. And there's not right and wrong, easy decisions that we make.
You have 1 minute remaining.
Thank you, Your Honor. So the sad, unfortunate truth here, this is one of those decisions where there was no good result. Once that train got there too early, we were destined for a catastrophe. The decision-making had to be about what's the least bad result or the most good result. And Mr. Andre clearly would have had he would have felt horrific whichever choice he made. Do you think he would feel better if he had been responsible for 300 lives? Do you think he would feel better if his son believed that he had saved him to cause the deaths of 300 other people? This prosecution is exactly like a carpenter blaming the fact that he doesn't like his house on his saws and hammers, or the fisherman blaming his poor fishing day on a hook. Ethics is a framework, ethics is a process to help us make decisions, but the decisions and the consequences are ours.
But I think it presents an interesting dilemma. And the key question, and I'm going to ask all of our panel to comment on this, is ethics what she portrayed herself to be, just a mere guideline, just kind of in the air and it's out there, it's within you? Or is it something more than that? And from where do we derive that voice that speaks into our ear? So Steve, let me start with you.
All right. Having thought through this case, and you know, this is, I teach this to large numbers of students at the University of Oklahoma, so I've had a chance to think about this a lot. I think one of the things that I would want to say that's really important is that when you're thinking about ethics, it is important to see that it's not merely a list of rules and not merely even a sort of decision-making tool. It's a kind of way of life. It's a perspective on what's valuable. And I think one of the things that the way this sort of trial is put together, it shows that if you act on a set of rules that you haven't wholeheartedly internalized, you're likely to be really disappointed in the results. So, I thought one of the things that the prosecution did well was point out the sort of positive aspects of Dimitri's decision. In a way, one of the things that Dimitri probably needed to do himself as a kind of consolation, there's no good answer, is to sort of internalize the ethical perspective on those things so he could see the positive aspects. One of the things about sort of getting prepared for this role is you have to sort of, you know, Dimitri is someone who's very focused on his son, and that probably isn't what ethics suggests. So I think I'm a fan of the ethical viewpoint. I think it's the correct set of values, you know, but it's one that you have to internalize and not merely follow.
Good, good. Gloria?
I'm going to pass down here.
I had 3 hours of philosophy at OSU. This is beyond me.
We trained all those guys, by the way, I want you to know.
I just think it's an interesting exercise because it helps highlight, you know, the real question is, what is it? I think when we were doing our planning session, you had mentioned, is it an algorithm or is it a guideline? And I think that's the interesting question, is do whatever these ethical rules that we have compel a result, or do they assist in a process of getting to a result? Which I think it's got to be the second, doesn't it? I mean, it's got to be the second. So Jim, virtually, to me, has, you know, a very difficult time presenting that other side, which is all we are is people that get programmed, and you put in data, and here's a decision. That would be my thinking on it based on my 3 hours at OSU.
All right, Justice Courage?
I'm just going to hold on to this. You know, there are so many different ways of looking at ethics. The questions that we were dealing with today, I mean, we're involved in ethical dilemmas all the time about going this way or that way. You know, simple things constantly. We're constantly bombarded with decisions. And it's not a right and wrong as much as it is a best or better. Sometimes there are really two good choices to make. As a member of the legal profession, we have professional ethics, we have judicial ethics. We try to tell people who are coming into the profession as law students that the rules of ethics are really the minimum. That's really they're guidelines, but they're the minimum. That ethics requires more than just following a rule. In the case that we talked about today, I mean, I think Dimitri was confronted with two poor choices. And he followed the rule in his mind, I guess, of the majority. The majority won because there were 300 versus 1. But that's sort of the minimum. I mean, what he's got to deal with in his heart for the rest of his life is not only did his son die, but had he chosen the other way, all these other people would have died. And I think that he will come to peace eventually with his decision, because I think under the circumstances, his decision was the only one that any rational person would have made. And, you know, sacrifice, for Lodge to sacrifice his life, I mean, that's one of our great Christian principles. Hopefully we don't have to go to the extreme where we die for our beliefs, but we need to certainly be willing to talk about it and stand up for it. So I just think there's so many things to take into account, but I am very, I would say very complimentary of this organization looking at these very serious issues.
Because I do work at a church, we focus a great deal on, of course, this sort of story and self-sacrifice, the sacrifice of one for the good of many. We're leading into Easter. This is a story that's probably very familiar to you all. And if not, I will gladly tell you all about it. But we are also highly concerned with orthodoxy, meaning right belief. But what we're talking about here is orthopraxis and right practice. And sometimes we find ourselves in situations and we're having to make particular decisions, which is right, which is the lesser of two evils. And we can trace, and we find ourselves there and we say, how did I get in this spot? And we can trace back to a series of fudges and stepping into the gray area and not exactly going the direction of orthopraxis and not exactly going into right practice, but maybe fudging a little. And that leads us to those places where we face more ethical dilemmas because we create them for ourselves based on all those little choices. There are times like this one where this wasn't a situation born out of a series of other poor decisions or gray decisions or questionable decisions. And so sometimes we get ourselves in the predicaments where we have to choose, and it's a very, very hard choice and a painful choice. Sometimes we're just there in the moment. And that's when our sense of integrity and who we are as people and who we are at the core of our system of beliefs kicks in. And that's really where the ethics kick in for us.